One of the reasons I think there's a lack of commercialism in HR is because often people have gone into HR because they made a conscious decision not to go into some of the other fields that they could have chosen, and IT and finance are some of those fields. So sometimes it's because the people that you find in HR genuinely don't have an interest in finance. And I think to be commercial, financial acumen is one of those foundational capabilities that you need. I also think HR have got into the habit of not thinking they have to justify themselves. It's like almost we believe we have a right to exist in the organization. Because there's people, we need HR. And I think increasingly we should challenge that line of thought. And we should say, like every other part of the business, if you want your function to be invested in, you should be able to have to justify that in the form of a proper business case. I think organizations, particularly medium to large size organizations, will always need human resources, but I think it will look very different in the future. We're moving now perhaps to the next phase of HR's evolution. I think for me what that means for the future is that HR will seek to commoditize a lot of its current products and processes and outsource them to people who specialize in doing those things. So IT to IT specialists, payroll to payroll specialists, even recruitment to recruitment specialists, and focus on the real value-add services that require a really specific knowledge of the business in which that HR functioning is working to add value. And that's what organizations will be left with in the future. For me in the future, when you meet a business partner or an HR generalist, the first litmus test for me, if you will, is when I'm talking to that person, I should become confused as to whether they're a person who works in the business or a person who works in HR. They should sound like they could be either or both. Because for me, the real key to the business partner role is that they're able to integrate the full offering from the HR function with an understanding of the life cycle, if you will, with the absolute agenda of the business, right from the external pressures and demands that they're facing to the internal challenges and demands that they're facing. And the business partner will be able to present solutions to the leader in a way that integrates those two agendas in a seamless way. The business mustn't feel like they're talking to an HR person when the HR person is talking to them. Equally, when the relationship manager or HR generalist is talking to the HR function, it shouldn't sound like a business person, it should sound like an HR person. A degree of schizophrenia might be useful because it's almost like you play those two roles. You have to juggle between the two of them, and it has to be done in a seamless way if you're going to add value to your HR function that sits almost behind you and your business that sits in front of you. The first thing for me is possibly a healthy balance between commercialism and empathy. I think in the past we've had HR functions that have been very empathetic but not very commercial. We certainly don't want to move to a position where we're so commercial that we lose all our empathy. Because I think in some respects the HR function, when it faces off to the leadership of the business, is there to remind the business that its human resource is not the same as its other resources. It's not the same as its capital, it's not the same as its products, it's not the same as its IT infrastructure. It is different. HR functions should be asking themselves that question more often than they currently do. I probably would answer it with two parts. The one is the more usual, the more cliched one that says that in organizations, most aspects of the organization have become commoditized. So access to capital, access to technology, access to customer base, all commoditized. The one thing that still is not commoditized in most industries are the people. And so if an organization really wants to get that discretionary effort from its people, and if they really want to make sure that people align their efforts to the strategy and the objectives of the organization, I think HR, with its unique understanding of both the business and the human aspect, bring a unique set of values into the business. I think on the other hand though, if you take a look at leadership today, and you take a look at what's happened just in the last decade, the pressures being placed on leadership and the requirements of leadership have shifted significantly. And I think you just have to take a look at the corporate scandals over the last even 2 years, let's be really current, and take a look at the fact that they span just about every single industry. It says that the requirements of leaders have taken a quantum leap forwards in a very short space of time. We've got leaders who've developed because they've been technically very competent in their field, and they've also demonstrated a set of behaviors such as high drive, command and control, sometimes a strong ego, But if you take a look at what's required of leadership today, what you'll find is that some of those behaviors and some of those attributes are actually becoming devalued. In fact, it's some of those attributes that are the very things that have landed companies in trouble. HR is in a unique position to hold the mirror up to the leadership. 1 to 2 decades ago, the command and control structure in organizations was much stronger. And they thought that that was the way to manage the best out of people. And I think we're realizing as we move on, and as the generations change, and as the external pressures change, that you can no longer run an organization in that way, or very few organizations can be run successfully in that way. So for me, it's about how you engage and how you remain connected with your people. And for me, you know, in the old days, I guess that was the union notion of consultation, but that's not the notion of consultation I'm talking about. I'm talking about a real, genuine dialogue and a free flow of information in all directions, not just from top to bottom. Social media and the expectations of the workforce, I think, create a need for and enable a dialogue in an organization to reach a completely different level. And I think, you know, it does have to be managed, but I think not too tightly, because that's contrary to what social media and that level of connectivity is all about. And I think increasingly in the future, organizations who succeed will be those that can demonstrate a high level of connectivity. And I think this goes way beyond employees, although I think we've got a lot to learn about how we connect with our employees. But I think it's a level of connectivity with all of our stakeholders. So that's a level of connectivity with our customers, which I think organizations often forget, or they think that their current way of connecting with their customers is sufficient. But customers are changing, and their expectations are changing. It's how you connect with your shareholders. If you're in a regulated industry, and most people are to varying levels, it's how you connect with your regulator. And so I think that social media is changing the nature of both of those interactions, but also the expectations that people have. I think if we take a look at what's happened over the last 5 years, and we try and plot it as a trend, and we plot it forwards into the next 10, 20 years, I think that the one thing we can be certain of is that what the workplace will look like in 10 years will be very, very different to how it's looked for the last 10 years. I think our leadership need to embrace that, and I think HR has a role to play if we can be on the forefront of these debates. I think that social media will play a much larger part. I think levels of connectivity will play a much bigger part. I think the expectations about flexibility in the organization will play a much bigger part. All of these things will change. The things we take for granted today, in especially medium and large-size corporates. And the reason I exclude smaller organizations is because I think typically, even today, they are more flexible, they can be more individual, and you have much more of the leader's stamp of individualism on the organization. But when you get to medium and large-size corporates, what you tend to find happening is that the ability to do that is removed. Things become much more standardized. And I think in the future, the trend will be away from that into something that's much more flexible, much more dynamic. Organizations have to be much more responsive in the future than they are today and have been certainly in the past. And I think that applies to all industries. I think consumers expect it, and I think the pace of change necessitates it. And so that level of responsiveness doesn't come with the traditional organizational design. So understanding organizational design for the future has to also center around that level of responsiveness, I think.